Some stories stick with you because they feel a little too real. In today's video, we're diving into the creepiest true stories people have ever told. Tales so disturbing, you might question whether they really happened or not. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm making these videos to help raise funds for my dad's medical treatment, and every bit of support helps. If you'd like to contribute, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here, and now, let's get into these spine-tingling stories. Story 1. Back when I was in 5th grade, I stumbled upon a Pokemon-themed chat room on Yahoo that quickly became a regular hangout for about 15 of us. Most of the people there were between the ages of 12 and 16. And we had a blast role-playing anime characters and coming up with various storylines. It was this tight-knit online group where we bonded over shared interests. Over time, I got to know some of the people from the chat room well enough to talk outside of it, either on AIM or through phone calls. A few of those friendships lasted several years. One guy in particular was a bit eccentric. He was obsessed with creature models like Godzilla, Spawn, and other monster stories. He also believed in things like chupacabras, which I found strange, but it wasn't a big deal to me at the time. He lived out in a rural part of the Midwest, which felt like another world to my West Coast self. After countless hours of phone conversations over the years, this guy eventually shared a disturbing secret with me. He admitted that he sometimes blacked out and would wake up to find that he had been hurting or torturing animals and even children. He lived near a lot of family members, including younger cousins and neighbor kids, and apparently, he had killed some animals during these blackouts. When he told me this, I felt a cold chill go through my veins. Always loved animals, and hearing this made me feel sick. He said I was one of the only people he had ever confided in about this, and I could tell it was difficult for him to talk about. Then, things took an even darker turn. He told me that someone in his family, or maybe it was a family friend, became convinced that he was possessed by a demon. So, they decided to perform an exorcism on him. It was done at night, of course, in a dark room lit only by candles, and they tied him to a bed because they didn't know how the demon might react. As he described this part of the story, his voice started to tremble, and I could tell he was really emotional and scared. The process was creepy enough, but the most terrifying part was what happened at the end. He said that after the exorcism, they heard something hit the floor beneath the bed. Then, whatever it was scrambled across the floor and out of the room, leaving claw marks behind in the wooden floorboards. He was dead serious about this whole experience and claimed that the exorcism had worked. He no longer hurt animals or people after that. After he told me this, I was completely freaked out. I didn't want anything to do with the situation anymore, so I slowly distanced myself and eventually cut off contact. It was too much for me to handle, and I wasn't about to stick around and find out if any of it was true. Story 2. My grandmother had the same recurring nightmare for most of her life. In this dream, she would walk down a long, dark hallway, turn left, open a door, and be met with something so terrible, she would wake up before seeing what it was. The dream always ended the same way. She never got to see what was on the other side of that door. Fast forward to her 40s. She, my grandfather, my dad, and my aunt were on a family vacation. They had booked their hotel rooms last minute, and ended up having to get 2 separate rooms with twin beds on opposite sides of the floor. One night, around 3 a.m., my dad woke up with a sense of unease. He called out into the darkness, "Dad," but got no response. He switched on the bedside lamp and tried again, a little louder this time. Still, no answer. Worried, he got out of bed and went to shake his father awake, but something was very wrong. His father wasn't responding at all. Panicked, my dad ran down the hallway to my grandmother's room and began pounding on the door. When she opened it, he frantically told her something was wrong with my grandfather. Without hesitation, she followed him back down the hallway. a long hallway, to the last door on the left. When she entered the room and turned to the left, just like in her nightmare, she saw her husband lying dead in bed. He had passed away from a heart attack. After that night, she never had the nightmare again. Story 3. When I was about 7, my grandmother took care of a baby named John. His mother was an alcoholic and drug addict, who would leave him with my grandmother for months at a time. Over time, John became like a part of our family. We loved him, and my grandmother treated him like one of her own. One night, John's mother came to pick him up, and her drunk boyfriend was driving. On their way home, the boyfriend flipped the car. John was severely injured and ended up in a coma for about 3 or 4 days. During that time, something strange happened. In the middle of the night, my older brother suddenly woke up, screaming and crying. He was inconsolable. When my parents managed to calm him down enough to speak, he told them that John had come into his room, crying. John told him that he had to leave, but was scared and wanted my brother to come with him. My parents tried to reassure him, telling him it was just a bad dream. But right then, the phone rang. It was my uncle, calling from the hospital to inform us that John had just passed away. Even though this happened over 30 years ago, it still sends shivers down my spine every time I think about it. Story 4. I used to live near a camp that I attended as a kid. When I was about 7, there was this one counselor that everyone found strange. He was Russian, part of the camp's international staff exchange program, which brought in counselors from all over the world. But this guy was different. Something about him just didn't sit right with anyone. He had this eerie reputation among the other counselors. People said he was unbelievably fast, and, during staff-only campfires, he would do the unthinkable: catch live rabbits, skin them right there, and eat them. It freaked everyone out, but it was somehow overlooked. The creepiest thing, though, was his sleeper hold move. It was this wrestling hold that would knock someone out for a few seconds. I saw him do it once to another counselor, who passed out for about 10 seconds before coming to. After that, the camp banned him from doing it, but kids, being curious, would still ask him to show them the move in secret. And he did, except he started making it more intense, keeping kids unconscious for longer and longer periods of time. Then one night, everything changed. A camper went missing. He was in his bunk when the cabin went to sleep, but by morning, he was gone. The camp launched a massive search, keeping all the campers on the soccer field while they looked. After hours of searching, they found him under the sailing dock, completely unconscious with strangulation marks around his neck. He was alive, but barely. Everyone knew who was responsible. The Russian counselor was immediately arrested and later deported back to Russia. But here's the twist: after investigating, it turned out the camp never even sent for a Russian exchange counselor that year. No one knew who he was or where he had come from. It was like he just showed up one day, and no one questioned it until it was too late. Story 5. When my daughter was 4 years old, I thought she was fast asleep one night when I suddenly heard strange noises coming from her upstairs bedroom. At first I couldn't make out what was being said, so I quietly approached the room, but the moment I got close, the talking stopped. Thinking I might have startled her, I opened the door. She was sharing the room with her 3-year-old sister at the time. I found my 4-year-old sitting up in bed, so I smiled and asked, "Is everything okay?" She responded that everything was fine, but then her younger sister chimed in, saying that they were keeping her up. Confused, I asked, "Who's keeping you up?" My 4-year-old apologized, saying she had been talking. When I asked her who she was talking to, my 3-year-old sat up and calmly said, "The girl in the window. She told us you were coming." That response sent a chill down my spine. I tried to keep my composure and asked who the girl was, but both of them said she just stood in front of the window at night and talked to them. Not knowing how to respond, I simply tucked them back in and stayed just outside their door for a while, listening, but everything seemed quiet. The next day, I cautiously brought it up again, asking if the girl had come back. My 4-year-old said she had, but that this time the girl was mad. I let it go for a few days, trying not to dwell on it, but about a week later, my wife asked me out of the blue, "Who are the girls talking to upstairs?" My stomach dropped. I rushed upstairs, and when I entered the room, both girls were sitting under the window, looking up as if someone was standing there. They turned to look at me and asked, "Do you want to meet the girl?" But when they turned back to the window, they looked disappointed. "She's gone now," they said. It's been about 5 years since all of this happened, and I haven't heard anything about the girl in the window since then. To this day, I have no explanation for what they experienced, but I still think about it, and it still gives me chills. Story 6. When I was about 11, a few friends and I decided to have a slumber party. Late that night, we got the bright idea to sneak out of the house and head over to a park that was only about half a block away. It felt like a harmless bit of fun at the time, and we spent at least an hour just hanging out and talking. At some point, I thought I saw something, a large, shadowy figure about 100 feet away, standing under the trees. It was hard to make out, but I was sure there was something there. I pointed it out, and the rest of the group turned to look. We stared in that direction for a solid 5 minutes, squinting and trying to figure out if we were just imagining it. Just when we started to convince ourselves that it was nothing, maybe a trick of the light, the figure suddenly moved. It bolted out from the shadows and began sprinting toward us at full speed. Panic shot through all of us, and without even thinking, we jumped up and ran as fast as we could back to the house. Our hearts were pounding, and the whole way we felt like we were being chased. Once inside, we slammed the door shut and locked it, breathing heavily. That should have been the end of it, but then we heard something. Footsteps. Someone was outside, moving around the house. And then, the tapping started. There was a soft but deliberate tapping on the windows. We were terrified, but we couldn't wake anyone up without admitting we had snuck out, so we stayed huddled together in the middle of the living room, too scared to move. We were sure that whoever was outside was going to break in at any moment. All night, we waited, thinking this was it, that we were about to be murdered. Thankfully, nothing happened, and by morning, the tapping had stopped. We never figured out who or what had been out there, but none of us ever dared sneak out again after that night. Story 7. My mum, grandparents, aunt and uncles, and several of their neighbors all swear they saw a UFO hover over my grandparents' house back in the late 1960s. They said it just hung there, silently spinning, except for a faint whizzing sound that lasted for a minute or two. The UFO had a ring of colors around it, glowing in all sorts of strange hues. My mum and grandma said they remember the television and radio in the living room suddenly turning on at full blast. The transmissions they received were from other countries, in languages they couldn't understand. Meanwhile, appliances in the kitchen started rattling, as though something was affecting the entire house. My uncle, who was on the top floor, said the UFO was hovering right outside his bedroom window. He was too scared to move, and just stood there, frozen, staring at it. Another time, about 10 years ago, I think I saw a UFO too, with my mum. Our house backs up to farmland, with our backyard stretching for about a mile. We were out there one night when we saw a bright, white light bouncing in the middle of the field. It moved strangely, like it was bouncing from one spot to another. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the light shot up into the sky and disappeared, vanishing in an instant. While I've never been able to explain it, those two experiences, especially the one my family witnessed back in the 60s, have left a lasting impression. Something about them feels real, something unexplainable that still makes me wonder about what's out there. Story 8. 10 years ago, about 2 years after my mother passed away, my dad was getting remarried. Before my stepmom officially moved in, we had to clean out a lot of the house to combine 2 families' worth of stuff. One morning, while we were cleaning, my babysitter and I found one of my mother's old mugs. It was a fancy one, with the emblem of her college on it, and we accidentally left it in the upstairs office. We didn't think much of it at the time. A few hours later, my dad came home from work, and to our surprise, the mug was downstairs in the kitchen, sitting right on top of a stack of wedding invitations. No one had touched it since that morning, and we couldn't explain how it had ended up there. We joked about it for a while, calling it the haunted mug, and laughing about how it was my mum giving her approval of the wedding. Nothing more happened for a while, but then, a little over a year after the wedding, something else occurred. My stepmom had misplaced her car keys one morning and spent half an hour searching all over the kitchen, retracing her steps multiple times around the island counter. After thoroughly checking every nook and cranny, she was on what must have been her 50th lap when she finally spotted her keys. To her surprise, they had appeared on one of the corners of the counter, and sitting right next to them was the same mug. We decided to put it on a high shelf after that, and it hasn't moved since. It's a small thing, but every now and then, I think about the mug and the little moments like that, which made it feel as though my mum was still looking out for us in some strange, inexplicable way. Story 9. My friend once shared with me a story that still gives me chills. She explained why she started taking sleeping pills, and it had to do with something that happened when her family lived in Georgia. They had bought an older, grand house, something a wealthy family would have owned, and it had a lot of character. She told me that one day, while her dad was fixing some plumbing in the crawl space, she found an old purple dinosaur toy. She started playing with it and would keep it with her, even sleeping with it in her bed along with other toys. It seemed harmless at first, but then, one night, she woke up to the dinosaur staring at her, now standing on her chest. It was in a completely different position than she had found it, or than it had been the past few weeks. She set it aside, trying to shrug it off. Over the next 3 weeks, the same thing happened again. No matter where she put it on the floor, in a drawer, it would always end up back on her chest. One night she locked it up in a drawer to see if that would stop it. She couldn't sleep, and eventually heard the drawer unlock, open, and slam shut. Then, she heard small footsteps. When she opened her eyes, the dinosaur was right back on her chest. Terrified, she pretended to be asleep while it shifted and sat there, staring at her. The next day, she told her mum, but of course, her mum didn't believe her. That was, until her mum saw the same thing happen after they locked the dinosaur in their room. It didn't stop there though. Other strange things started happening around the house, and eventually, the family moved out. But the weird part was, the dinosaur stayed at the old house. I think she said they buried it, hoping to rid themselves of it for good. For a year and a half, they thought it was gone. But one day, when they moved into their new house, the dinosaur reappeared. It was sitting on the kitchen counter, just like it had been when they first found it. After that, my friend said they burned the dinosaur and threw it in a river, and they never saw it again. But even then, my friend's troubles didn't end. She started having nightmares, so vivid and real that she needed the pills to help her sleep. Over the years, she's had several hospital visits after waking up with scratches on her body, which the doctors claimed were from night terrors. Now, she's 10 years older, but she still can't drink because of the sleeping pills, and she still struggles with her sleep. She's told me that sometimes, even now, she feels uneasy in her current home. I don't know if this was all real, or if it was a wild imagination of a scared 13-year-old. But the way she spoke about it, the way her eyes welled up with tears, I believe her. I don't know why, but I do. It's scary to think about, and even though I might be a little obsessed with creepy stories, there's something about this one that makes me wonder if there's more to it. Story 10. When my cousin was about 7 years old, his room was in the basement of their house. The basement was half above ground and half below, and his bed was right next to a window that overlooked the outside. One night, out of nowhere, he woke up in the middle of the night and opened his eyes, only to find a man crouched outside the window, staring directly at him. My cousin froze in fear, not knowing what to do. After a few seconds, he turned over in bed, faced the wall, and eventually fell back asleep. It wasn't a one-time thing either. The stranger kept coming back on random nights. Sometimes he'd just stand there, staring through the window. Other times, he would tap on the glass with his finger. The scariest part was when my cousin noticed that the wall opposite the window had a mirror. One night, while the stranger was outside, he turned over in bed to avoid looking at him. But then, the stranger shined a flashlight through the window and bounced the beam off the mirror, illuminating my cousin's face as if to say, "I can still see you." But it only got worse from there. One night, the stranger grew bolder. He started pushing on the window, testing if it was unlocked. Luckily, it was locked, and the man never got in. To this day, my cousin has no idea who the man was or what he wanted. He has never told his parents about it. He's 31 now, and the memory still haunts him. Story 11. This happened to my parents about 20 years ago, and it's always stuck with them. They were driving out to Death Valley for a weekend trip in the winter, and they left late in the day, planning to arrive at the hotel by nightfall. The hotel was located about 30 minutes outside of the Death Valley town center, so it was pretty isolated. When they finally got to the hotel, it was completely abandoned. My mom, who gets spooked easily, didn't want to go check it out, but my dad was more adventurous and wanted to investigate. He got out of the car and started walking around the back of the building. As he was doing that, a man approached my mom's side of the car. The man claimed his motorcycle had broken down and that he delivered newspapers to Death Valley. My mom looked around, but there was no sign of a motorcycle anywhere. There was no other building in sight, just the empty hotel. The man started begging my mum to take a stack of newspapers and deliver them to a hotel in town, saying that if he didn't get them delivered, he would lose his job. He even had the newspapers in his hands and asked her to open the car door so he could hand them to her. By this point, my mum was getting seriously weird vibes from the guy, so she refused, locked all the doors, and told him to go away, but he kept pleading with her. Just then, my dad came around the corner, and when the man saw him, he seemed to panic. Without saying another word, he handed the stack of newspapers to my dad and quickly left, walking off into the desert. My parents drove off, a little shaken, and when they finally got to the hotel to deliver the papers, they went inside and spoke to the lady at the desk. When they handed her the newspapers, she looked confused and told them that they didn't get any newspapers delivered to the hotel. Curious, my parents opened up the stack and looked at the front page of one of the newspapers. It was from 1954. Story 12. This story takes place in an old house in New Zealand, where my family lived for about 5 years. It was a house with a lot of strange, unexplainable events. And while I usually try to disregard paranormal activity from a scientific standpoint, there were things that happened there that I just can't explain. We experienced the usual stuff, doors slamming when there was no breeze, footsteps echoing down the hall when no one was there. But there were a few moments that really stand out. One night, my whole family was awoken by a loud smash. We rushed to the source of the noise and found a vase smashed on the bathroom floor. The strange thing was that it had been sitting on the windowsill above the sink, but when it fell, it didn't land in the sink. Instead, it had bypassed the sink entirely and smashed into the middle of the room, about 7 feet away. My mum often claimed to have woken up feeling like someone was breathing on her face. But for me, the most terrifying experience happened one night when I was 7 years old. I woke up in my room to a sound I couldn't ignore: heavy breathing, like someone was lying on the floor next to my bed. I was already familiar with the sensation of labored breathing due to asthma, so at first I thought it might just be me breathing strangely. but after holding my breath for a while, I could still hear the sound. It wasn't me. I couldn't bring myself to look over the side of the bed to see if someone was there, but luckily, the sound was coming from the opposite side of the room, not between me and the door. It took me what felt like forever, but after about 10 minutes of sheer terror, I finally gathered enough courage to jump out of bed and run to my parents' bedroom, screaming and crying. I ended up sleeping in my mum's bed that night, but I never forgot the sound of that heavy breathing. The house had its share of other oddities, but that night is still burned into my memory. Story 13. This happened to me a few years ago, and it still sticks with me. I've never been the type to judge much, so I used to give hitchhikers and strangers rides if they seemed like they could use it. One day, I was washing my car in the driveway before leaving for class when I saw a guy walking down my street. I live in a not-so-great neighborhood, so it's not uncommon to see sketchy figures, but this guy definitely caught my attention. He looked off, his clothes were cheap, badly cleaned dress clothes, a wrinkled white button-up shirt with the sleeves undone, black slacks that were just as bad, and an old, battered black briefcase. His head was shaved, and he was scrawny, almost like he had been starving somewhere. When he got close, he asked if I could give him a lift. I had a weird feeling about him, but I said sure. I asked him where he needed to go, and he gave me a vague answer, saying he'd give me directions and that it wasn't far. We made a quick stop at the local liquor store, where he grabbed a beer and some cigarettes. He offered me both, but I declined. We continued driving, and he mentioned that it was his first day out of jail after serving 3 years. I didn't know what to say, so I just congratulated him, and he thanked me while cracking open the beer. We finally reached his destination right at the edge of a rough neighborhood, a well-known hangout for gang members. I dropped him off, and he thanked me again before heading inside. Now, fast forward about 5 years. I'm watching the news, and there he is, again the same guy. Impossible to mistake him. This time though, he's in a courtroom, testifying at a murder trial. The murder happened at the very same place I dropped him off, about 3 weeks after that ride. It turns out that he was the only person who could testify against the people who killed someone there. People who were part of the gang he was in before he went to jail. The person who was murdered. He would have been a member of my family through marriage if he hadn't been killed. And this guy, the one I gave a ride to, was the only one who testified against the gang members who did it. I still get chills just thinking about it. When I saw him on the witness stand, the entire trial gave me goosebumps. It was as if fate had somehow connected us without me even knowing it at the time. Story 14. When I was a kid, we moved into a new house, and one of my earliest memories was how cold my brother's room always felt, though I never thought much of it at the time. But as I got older, I eventually moved into that same room, and it wasn't cold anymore. Curiously, I asked my mum about it, and she told me that when we first moved in, my sister had actually taken that room. She had awful nightmares, and when she would wake up, there were bruises on her legs and stomach. My mum also had nightmares about a woman telling her to leave the house. Eventually, she performed some kind of ritual, and after that, everything stopped. No more cold room, and no more nightmares. A few years later, when my sister was getting married, my grandma and 3 female cousins I had never met before came to stay with us. My mum mentioned that my grandma didn't like staying at our house because she always got sick when she visited. My cousins stayed in my sister's old room, and after the second night, they were really scared. They said someone had been trying to open their door. The doorknob would jiggle, and when they opened it, no one was there. They came to my room asking if they could sleep in there, and although I thought they were just trying to scare me, I let them. I slept on the floor, and they took my bunk bed. Suddenly, I heard the washer turn on. The laundry room was right next to my room, so I went out to turn it off, but when I returned, I heard chains dragging across the floor outside my door. I opened it, but no one was there. It was creepy because, after all the years I'd lived there, nothing like this had ever happened to me. I eventually fell asleep, but the next morning I was curious and went to my sister's old room. What I saw freaked me out. There were faint black marks on the ceiling that looked like footsteps, and the window was wide open. The thing that really terrified me was that the window couldn't have been opened from the inside because a second glass had been installed. Incorrectly, it could only be opened from the outside, and we lived on the second floor. Whoever opened it would have had to use a ladder. After that, nothing strange happened again, and when everyone left, I talked to my mom about what had happened. She told me that the house didn't like new people, especially females. That made sense to me, as I had never experienced anything unusual except for the cold room, and my grandma had always gotten sick when she stayed. Still, from time to time, when I was sleeping, I would hear a baby crying. I thought it was just my neighbor's baby, but it never really bothered me. When we moved out, my mum made me say goodbye to all the neighbors, even the ones I didn't talk to. When I said goodbye to the family next door, the ones I thought had the baby crying, I asked how their baby was doing. They told me they didn't have a baby. About 7 years after I moved away, I visited the house again. My old room had changed a lot and was bigger. I asked the current owners why it was bigger, and they told me that behind the closet, they found a hidden space, which made the closet twice the size. I asked if they had found anything in there, but they said no. I don't know if it's related to all the strange things that happened, but it was just another eerie detail I learned about that house years later. Story 15. About 1.5 years ago, my best friend of 15 years, and I decided to take a late-night trip out to my family farm after getting off our second shift jobs. It was a crisp, clear, early fall night in Michigan. We were sitting outside, chatting away and watching the sky when he asked a peculiar question. He said, "This place has always had a strange feel to it, almost like you're being watched. Did something happen here? Something bad, I mean." I laughed a little and told him the only stories I knew were ones my dad had told me. I went on to share a story about when my great-grandpa bought the farm back in the early 1930s. It was a big family project to keep the farm running, with relatives coming by to help out in exchange for the chance to hunt on the land. One evening, my great-grandpa's cousin came over to help with the chores and asked if he could go coon hunting that night. My great-grandpa agreed, and the cousin set out just after sundown. The next morning, my great-grandpa noticed the cousin's vehicle was still in the driveway, even though he should have left hours ago. It was still dark, but my great-grandpa knew the area well and set out to check on him. As he walked towards the back pasture, he called out the cousin's name. A voice answered, but something about it was wrong, almost too familiar, yet unsettling. When he called again, the voice that replied sounded like a growl, almost as though it were mimicking his cousin's voice, but with a chilling twist. My great-grandpa immediately ran back to the house, never looking back. When the sun came up, he took a group of family and farmhands to search for the cousin. They found his gun loaded, but never fired on his hat, which had brown liquid splattered on it, but there were no other signs of him. My great-grandpa spent over 60 years searching for him, never giving up hope. The only time he thought he might find something was when the swamp near the pasture dried up, but still, nothing was ever found. There's more to this story, but I've written a lot already. If you're interested, let me know, and I'll share the rest of the strange things that have happened on my family's farm. That is all for today. If you have enjoyed this video, do like and subscribe and let me know below of your thoughts. If you want to help in my dad's fundraiser, I would truly appreciate it. Hope you have an absolutely amazing day. You can also check my other videos on screen.